Hello, members. Welcome and good evening. My name is Anna Spooner from the Wine Society's tasting team. And this evening, we are joined, as always, for our focus on and sip size sessions by the lovely Mahesh behind the scenes. So hello, Mahesh. Good evening. I hope you're enjoying a glass of something delicious. And I hope all of you are as well, members. I can't thank you enough for joining, actually, considering we're probably, for most of you, I think other than a few on the West Coast, dragging you away from potential sunny evening barbecue time. So do let us know if you're joining from outside. I always like the idea of members joining with a laptop from outside. Or I can already see there's some sunny Northern Ireland, so that's great, Gary, and sunny York. Lovely to hear it, Roger. So welcome. Some of you may see my background's a bit different today. I'm gearing up for my wedding week, finally. So I'm actually out in France already, but I have brought all of the wines out here with me, which is wonderful. I love to bring different wines out to the Southern Rhone, but it's very, very warm here too. So I apologize if I drink a lot of water. I'm a little warm. But welcome one and all. I am really genuinely very excited about this evening's session. Oak in wine for me is fascinating, but I was lucky enough to go to Rioja a few weeks ago and go and meet some Coopers, who we'll talk about in a bit. Essentially really deep dive into understanding more about what oak really does. It's so easy to say, oh, it's an oaky wine or it's on a tasting note. But tonight we're going to deep dive into a bit of science. We're going to talk about what flavors to expect and why, and then unpick some of the language around oak. So why does the size of the barrel matter, or the age, and things like that. Please do continue to use the chat as you're using it. That's fantastic. If you have any questions, please pop those in the Q&A. Just makes things easier for Mahesh and I when we're filtering through the questions, because we try and ask and answer them as we go along through the session. So fingers crossed, it will all go wonderfully swimmingly this evening. And let's deep dive into, let's get serious. It makes sense for us to talk about the types of oak we use. Now, in true BBC style, I will mention that other woods are available. We are focusing on oak this evening, but my husband, who is a tree surgeon, often says, why only oak? It's not only oak, so you can use cherry, chestnut, acacia, very popular. I've heard mulberry used, but it's not very common. But actually there are, even within oak, hundreds of species, but really we only talk about 3 when we're talking about top quality oak for the production of barrels for wine. So they're special, and today you will hopefully learn why. So I've popped up the 3 species of oak most commonly used. Now, apologies in advance, my Latin is poor at best, so my pronunciation is not going to be great, but hopefully you won't mind. So let's quickly talk about these 3 different types of oak, because they all bring different things to the wine. Quercus alba, so should be on the left of your screen now, aka American oak. So you'll see that I've put it's found in Wisconsin, Minnesota. It's found in other places in the USA as well. Those are 2 top areas for growing it. What does it bring? So if something says it's American oak, what do we mean by that? Well, there's a low phenol content. We won't go into too much about what phenols are, but yeah, essentially what you're actually getting mainly from American oak is instead this high concentration of aromatic substances. So you can get a lot of aromas from American oak, and of all the types of oak, it has the highest level of something called lactones, which we will talk about in a moment, but that gives a coconut flavor. Now, I remember Sarah Knowles MW once saying to me, because American oak is very popular in Rioja, and we are going to taste Rioja this evening. I remember she always said in blind tastings, she always just looked for the coconut, because American was so popular there. And that used to be a telltale sign. It's not so much anymore, but that classic coconut flavor, we'll talk about lactones in a minute, but that is a really, really typical Quercus alba or American oak flavor. Now, one thing to note before we move on to the French is, because of the way there's essentially something that blocks the xylem in the plant, and it actually grows slightly differently to the French versions. And what that means is that it's got this amazing liquid holding capacity, American oak. So actually, the way you produce barrels of American versus French oak is actually quite different. And it can be cut up slightly differently, American oak, which means it's much, much cheaper. In fact, there's so much waste. And I say waste, I don't mean it's actual waste, because you burn it and you use it for producing. And so it's not wasted material. But in terms of buying the oak, there's 40% more usable wood than the other two versions. So that's what makes it significantly cheaper. But it also adds these flavors that you don't get so much in the French. So the two types of French oak, we'll start with Quercus petrea, or also known as Quercus sessilus. Now, most people would say this is the finest type of oak. It's got this really tight grain, and what that means is it's the actual chemistry of the wood is very different. It's got high levels of extractable aromatics, and don't worry, I'm going to talk about what eugenol, lactones, vanillin are in a moment, but it has got high levels of those. Now, not as high vanillin as American. So you can probably guess what flavor vanillin gives, vanilla flavor. We'll talk about that in a sec. But it does still have very high levels of extractable aromatics. So you're going to get flavor from new Quercus petrea, or Quercus sessilus. So why can't I say that today? Sessilus. It does have a lower concentration of oaky tannins, and one thing that oak does is it can actually impart a different kind of tannin to the tannins found on the skin of the grape. It has these in lower concentrations. Now, the places you find this are eastern France, so particularly places like the Vosges Mountains in Alsace. Having driven through there recently, I can attest there is a lot of oak there. Hungary and even Russia are producing this particular species of oak. And then last but not least, Quercus robur. You can hear them called the pedunculate oaks. Those have the highest extractable polyphenols. So what that means is that you get this sort of structure in the wine, you get these tannins and things, but they're less aromatic. So you've got one type of French oak that's going to give you more aroma, and then one type of French oak that's going to give you more of the structural side of things. And in particular, French forests such as the Limousin, but also Slavonia, i.e. not Slovenia, is actually a part of Croatia. So if you ever hear people talk about Slovenian oak, and which is becoming increasingly popular, that's the species they're talking about. I just wanted to show you this map. I took this photo when I was visiting Muga at their cooperage a few weeks ago. And these are the forests that they get their different species of oak from. Now, they get both of the French kinds, but you can see here, they've got them circled on the map. They've got stars where their best ones are. When you go into a barrel room, you will see the cooper's name, but you will often also see, you'll get a toast level. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you'll be able to tell different coopers work with different forests. So you can start to tell where your wood has come from. And when I say, members, that the way that barrels are made and where they come from, that provenance is almost, if not on a par with the way wine is produced, you start to understand how mind-blowing it is. Muga in particular go and visit these particular forests and hand select the trees that they want. It is a big game, oak selection. So I just wanted to show you that. I thought it was a fascinating map, and it really does show you all the spots. So let's quickly talk about some of the science before we start on our first wine to taste, because I have just thrown a few little techie words around, and I thought it's better to explain what they are. So these are all aromas and sort of components that you can actually detect in oak. And, these are the scientific names, but I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what you should be tasting. And don't worry, I'm not going to keep referring to lactones throughout the whole session. We'd all need a huge case of wine to get through it. So lactones, aka oak lactones, you get two types. So we've already said that they're coconut based, or they taste like coconut, I should say. but you get cis and trans isomers of lactones. So alone, they just smell like coconut. And in wine, they tend to smell oaky coconut. The cis isomers are more earthy. So you can see down next to it, I've put a kind of earthy section and also a little more herbaceous, whereas the trans isomers are more spicy. So you tend to get in lactones this little group of flavors, but usually it will be coconut and earthy or coconut and spicy. Vanillin, vanilla. Now, it is literally the compound that is found in vanilla, but it's also found in oak. So I'm hoping in wine number one, we're going to pick it up. I certainly did today when I gave it a try. One thing I will talk about in a moment when we talk about when you use oak is really interesting. Vanillin, when you ferment wine in a barrel, and we will talk about that later, the yeast in the fermentation actually it reacts with vanillin in the oak, and it actually reduces the level of the flavor. It produces a weird vanilla ethanol, which is extraordinary. But it's worth noting that just because something has seen this lovely new oak barrel, your levels of vanillin can change based on whether you fermented it or you just chucked it right in to age it. So it's kind of a really big moving scale, vanilla in wine. So winemakers will pick and choose their procedures or their actions based on how much they want to extract of that vanillin flavor, because you can find that across all species of oak. Now, furfural, and I'm not sure I have actually pronounced that right, but I'm going to give it a go. So this is a flavor that comes from the heating of the barrels. And also what happens when you heat the barrels is the chemical reaction. You're basically degrading the natural sugar inside the oak. And that gives a really typical classic flavor that's hard to miss. It's sort of butterscotch, caramel. So the more you heat your barrel, the more likely you are to get those sorts of flavors. Eugenol in the middle of your screen there. Now that gives you a clove-like phenolic compound. So it gives this sort of clovey smell, which I think is absolutely delicious. And that comes from the seasoning process. So again, that comes from how the barrel is being produced. So depending on whether you char it more, etc. Sorry, not charring it, seasoning it, depending on how you lay it down. We'll talk about seasoning in a minute. But depending on how long you lay it down for, will increase or decrease your sort of clovey notes. And then I definitely can't pronounce the last one, guaiacol, and I'm going to get that wrong, but accept it. You can see it on the screen. It's smoky aromas. I actually sometimes get this really lovely burnt toast smell from oaked wines, and this is literally formed from the toasting of the barrels that we get this aroma. So there we go. There's some sciencey bits. There are other flavors we can get. I've put different levels of toast because you can get different burnt toast or toasted bread levels. Nutmeg, smoke, coffee. We've got chocolate. We've got sometimes a sort of white flour. Sometimes it's quite rare, but a floral note to it. Pine tree, fir can often come from barrels as well, and dill. And generally, you can get quite a herbaceous thing. Barrels don't just impart flavor. They do other things as well. But because we've got a wine that really does have lovely flavors of oak, I think it's a good place to stop and taste a wine. And then we'll move on to other things in a moment. For the member that asked the question on how do they toast the barrels, don't worry. I'm going to come into barrel production in just a moment. We've got plenty of time. But let's taste a wine. It's 1:15. We've had 15 minutes of me talking. We want to taste a wine. So this is the Hawke's Bay Barrique Reserve. So Barrique is a size of barrel. It's 225 litres. So they are literally putting the barrel in the name. It has been barrel fermented in French oak. I mentioned earlier that will slightly reduce the vanillin flavour because the fermenting in oak will have reacted. But hopefully you're still going to get some vanilla. I definitely do. It's very rich. There's a little bit of light spice for me on the nose from that barrel aging as well. Almost something slightly peppery. So if we're imagining, again, going back to those lactones, I'm more in the coconut spicy rather than the coconut earthy here. I'll explain what all of this means, but I want to give you the information whilst we taste. This has seen 14% new barrels. So the newer the barrel, the more flavour it imparts. So 14% new oak in this wine. So you can really smell it. It's 18% 1-year-old wood, so that's still imparting a decent amount of flavour. Another 18% 2-year-old, and then the rest 3 years and older. So we should smell oak in this wine. That's why I picked it. The barrels are mainly medium toasted, a little bit of light toast, and I will talk about the toasting process later. But members who are tasting along are just going to check out the chat. Can you smell some of those flavours that we've just had? Bordering on butterscotch. We're looking definitely at some sort of vanilla style flavors, but like I said, vanilla and coconut spice, not coconut earth for me. There's nothing earthy particularly going on the nose here. Do shoot into the chat if you're tasting along today. I'd love to know if you're getting any of those sorts of flavors. Something slightly smoky. I don't think it's very smoky. There's definitely more smoky wines in this. Yeah, so I've just seen John say that the oak is not too strong. So one of the reasons I think that the oak is not too strong, and you've really nailed it here, is the balance. They've got really, really ripe fruits. It's very juicy, peachy, melon. And one thing that New World wines can often do is, because of this extra ripeness in the fruit, they tend to be able to balance oak better. So sunnier climates tend to be able to handle a bit more oak maturation or oak aging. Not entirely true, because we're going to have 2 wines that are beautifully oaked from less sunny spots, but particularly with white wines, I would say. And Chardonnay is a glutton for oak. It really, really does suit it. So I think when it's done well, a really oaky Chardonnay like this is just heaven. So I'm going to have a taste. Oh, lovely freshness. It's got, on the palate for me, it's almost slightly more oaky because it has got that lovely vanilla finish to it. It's got a really soft mouthfeel. We'll talk a bit about what oak does to mouthfeel shortly. Not so much in white wines, but more in red wines. For anyone that wants to know, this was aged for 9 months, but it was lees stirred. I think, I want to say daily. I did speak to the winemaker yesterday. It might be weekly lees stirred, but that's going to add that creamy texture. But it's definitely got those lovely vanilla notes, that kind of sweet oak that works so well on a New World Chardonnay. Oh, I love it. What a wine. I hope members who are tasting along enjoyed it. I think that's absolutely stonking. And for £13.50, you get a lot of wine in your glass there. Yeah, full-bodied and luxurious. I couldn't agree more on Freddie's tasting note. It's a wine with roast chicken. It's a wine with fish pie. It's not a wine with your very, very light dishes. It's definitely got a bit more body to it than that. Right, let's go on, shall we? Because we've got so much more fun stuff to talk about, and you'll have to excuse my indulgence. I've actually included loads of my own photos in today's session because I seem to have gone on a barrel trip around Europe recently. So I've been learning lots about barrels, and I thought I wanted to share it with you. So this is fermenting in barrel. I was going to say 10 points for anyone that can guess. I think it's actually harder to guess from this angle where this is. But this was a recent trip I took with some fellow MW students to Lafite Rothschild, and this is their fermenting room. So they're not aging the wine in these big barrels. They are having their alcoholic and malolactic fermentation. So they're producing the wine in these barrels before they then age them in a completely different size barrel. So these barrels don't necessarily need to be new. In fact, they're often not. So these are older. And I think from memory, they replace them every 20 years because you're not imparting flavor, but you're doing other things. So why would you ferment in a barrel? It is increasingly popular, and basically people have now understood the science behind it. It is actually easier to do with white wines as well, particularly because with whites you are fermenting a juice. You've already got rid of the skins, but for reds you've got all the skins and bits in, a bit like a bad Halloween punch. So oak can actually be more challenging unless you've got serious pieces of kit to be able to move those skins around during the fermentation process. But what you really want is a vat that's not going to add too much influence on the wine. So why bother? Well, barrel fermented wines are better at highlighting textures, structures, mouthfeel. Instead of kind of preserving, so let's take a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, you get this primary gorgeous tropical fruit freshness, but you don't necessarily get mouthfeel. If you ferment in the barrel, you start to get a bit more mouthfeel in the wine, especially in whites as well. The oak is better integrated once you age it in a barrel. So I mentioned earlier, I mentioned that this was barrel fermented and then barrel aged. The reason you would do that, we've already spoken about managing your vanilla levels, but also it means that the oak, when it does come to integrate, is better. So often you don't need to spend so long in your aging barrels if you've fermented in an oak vat, or even in a small oak barrel. You can ferment in those small oak barrels, especially in white wines. We've just had a quick question. How do you control the temperature for those barrels? That is a great question, Victoria. They are all temperature controlled, those barrels. So they'll often have various pieces of kit, but you can put a cooling system inside the barrel, and that will keep your fermentation temperature at what you want to keep it at. You can also open the lids up, close them, and that will control the natural temperature. But yes, it is an expensive endeavor, and hence why red wine making is particularly challenging whilst fermenting in oak. So yes, Alistair, oak fermentation, it does impart some body, but what they really think is that it kind of gives the wine some structure and some mouthfeel. But the main thing is that it means that if you're then going to age it in oak, it's going to integrate. The final wine will be better integrated. So let's talk about micro-oxygenation, because that is really a textural. This is where we get into the proper texture of wine. We've spoken about the flavors. We've spoken about fermenting, which does some good for both flavors and texture. But really one of the things about oxygen and barrels, or I should say barrels and oxygen, is this micro-oxygenation point. Now, this is a photo I took in the barrel room at Muga a couple of weeks ago. This is particularly important to red wine. Now, you could argue that this micro-oxygenation is as important as the flavor piece. And actually, the wine we're going to taste next, the Rioja, certainly that's the case. So what is micro-oxygenation? You don't have to have a barrel to do micro-oxygenation. You can fake it by blowing very, very tiny oxygen bubbles through your wine. But the traditional way to allow a little ingress of oxygen would be to put it in a barrel. So interestingly, barrels are liquid tight. So they're not going to let water or wine escape. Who's putting water in a barrel? They're not going to let wine escape, but they are going to allow a little bit of controlled exposure into oxygen. Now, this is a 225 litre barrel, and it's believed, and this is just one of those sort of stats that doesn't really mean much. I can't comprehend it fully, but it's believed that a 225 litre barrel like this receives about 20 to 40 milligrams of dissolved oxygen per litre of wine per year. So my mental maths isn't great, but quite a decent chunk. But actually it's really hard to measure because the oak has its own tannins called elagitannins, and they actually absorb some of the oxygen on the way in. So the wine doesn't get all of it, but it does get a decent amount of oxygen. And what that does is, in the simplest terms, and this is not scientific, but I often describe it as it gives the wine a massage. So if you've got this big, burly, robust, very, very tannic wine, a bit of micro-oxygenation is going to help soften those tannins. The science bit about that is still a little bit up for grabs, but what they believe to be the case is that the tannins polymerize in the barrel because of the oxygen. So they join together, the chunky tannins, and then they drop out. Now, especially this can be achieved through racking between barrels. And what I've got here on this picture is to show you what racking is, where you move wine from one barrel to the next. But essentially, one of the things that this micro-oxygenation does is it softens those tannins. The other thing it does is it actually intensifies the color, strangely. It fixes the color more accurately. So the tannins and anthocyanins react together and they fix and intensify the color. So if you want a really stable colored wine, very good through micro-oxygenation of a barrel. And generally, this sort of process builds you a stable structure of the wine. So even if you're not having a hugely long period in oak, that micro-oxygenation is going to help form the structure of your wine. I'm conscious of size. Sorry, I'm conscious of time. So I'm going to move on to size, and then we're going to taste the next. Actually, I'll do size really quickly age as well, because they're really important, and then we'll taste the final wines as well. But based on what we've just talked about, we've talked about the oxygen ingress, and we've talked about the juice or the wine being in contact with the barrel and extracting things. So how that liquid, how much of that liquid is in contact with the barrel is really important. So it makes sense that the smaller the barrel, the greater the influence it has on that wine. And then therefore the converse ratio can be applied. The bigger the barrel, less wine is touching the outside. There's less potential oxygen ingress. So the bigger the barrel, the less influence. So we've just seen 225 litres. That was the traditional Bordeaux barriques. And to answer a question that popped up, one of those holds about 300 bottles of wine, if you are so interested. That is deemed the most popular and perfect ratio for ease to work with. Tokai used to have smaller size barrels, but they're moving away from it. But mostly 225 is like the smallest and easiest maneuverable. 228 is Burgundy. 500 litre is increasingly popular for people that don't want loads of oak influence, but just want a little bit. So lots of Austrian and German producers and Northern Italian producers actually are using these botti. So you hear it called botti, 500 litres. But bigger is even more common, tens of thousands. In this case, this is a picture I took years ago in Taylor's. Port is very interesting because tawny port can be aged a long time, and it's in big barrels because they want the micro-oxygenation but not the flavour. And I'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about age in just a second. But this is a huge barrel, obviously. But multiple thousand, even tens of thousands of litre barrels are becoming increasingly common. So by the wine we've just tasted saying it was barrique aged, that's 225. So they want you to know they have intentionally used small barrels to get more flavour and more oxygen and more everything. So when you see the barrel size, that's what they're trying to say. Let's quickly talk about age, and then we're going to go on to our next wine, because this was actually taken at the winery that produces this wine. So I took this photograph at Lopez de Heredia, which produces Tondonia and produces Viña Cubillo, which is our next wine. Age is important because every year the oak loses its ability to impart flavour. The micro-oxygenation doesn't really change, but the flavour concept does. So when they're brand new, we just heard that we had a 14% brand new oak barrels in the wine number one. That means they're packed with flavour. Every year they get less and less, and by about year 5, they're not really going to impart much flavour. So when you're reading technical notes on wines, it is actually important to see the age indication, because that's going to tell you, am I getting flavour or am I just getting a massage? It's really, that's the big difference. It makes a huge difference how old the wood is. It also makes a huge difference to your bank balance. And we hopefully will have time to really go into some numbers, but new oak is very, very expensive. But what if you don't want to impart flavours? Well, hey, that's what this wine we've got here is all about. This is an example. So there are 2 coopers in Rioja that have, there are 2 in-house wineries with in-house coopers. One is Muga, producing brand new oak. I showed you the photo of where they're getting their forests from, etc., or where they're getting their wood from the forests. This wine is from Tondonia. Tondonia by actually American oak. I'll talk to you about that in a second, but they also don't want lots of new oak flavors because that's not what their wine's about. Their wine is about really long aging, but not imparting flavors. So you can see this looks like a bit of a Frankenstein barrel. That's because their cooper actually doesn't focus on producing new barrels. It focuses on replacing staves that are damaged. So these strips you can see are called staves. It's about replacing staves in barrels that are damaged so that they never have to put wine in a fully new oak barrel, because that's not what they're about. So they want the massage, and they don't want to have a wine that tastes of vanilla. So there we go. Let's taste it. So from López de Heredia, it is the little brother or sister or sibling of their most famous wine, which is Vino Tondodia. This has been aged for 3 years in old American oak. Now you can see from the vintage it's 2013. They wanted to do the 3 years in oak, soften those tannins, but they didn't want to do the flavors. So we've already talked about that. And then what that's meant is that wine is ready for some aging in bottle. So you can see here, Pierre has described it as fine and silky. Now, if you can imagine, they quite highly extract the grapes to produce this wine to give it real structure to last nearly 10 years. But what they haven't done is, even with all of that structure, the tannins are really soft and supple. And that's come from those 3 years micro-oxygenation in the old American oak. So let's have a taste. Smell-wise or aroma-wise, I'm getting more of the kind of earthy notes, but not from the oak necessarily. It's because the grapes are getting older. So I'm getting this lovely umami, savory character. I'm also getting lots of dried fruits, dried raisins, dried berries, figs, plums, those sorts of things. And I'm not getting any vanilla. If you are getting vanilla, shout. Considering it's American oak, they source all of their oak from one particular mountain range, that Appalachian. That doesn't sound very American, but I think that's what it is. It's an expensive endeavor to keep fixing these barrels, but they don't want lashings of vanilla or coconut or any of those flavors, which is common in Rioja. They don't want that. They want wines that show this sort of finesse with age, and the ageability is coming from the oak, but they don't want to have the flavor. So, oh, it smells gorgeous. It's like Christmas spices as well. It's got a beautiful, beautiful nose. So I'm going to have a taste. Oh, that is a cracking wine. It is so good. It's silky, smooth. It's still got that kind of little bit of tannic grip, but my mouth is feeling refreshed. I feel it's very vibrant. It tastes much younger than a 10-year-old wine. Members, again, if you're tasting along with this wine this evening, I'd love to hear what you think. It's a really, really special wine, and I think ridiculous value for money. I will confess I've just bought a case of it. It is crazy. Oh, somebody has given me the name of the mountain range. Thank you, Mahesh. I'm going to, Mahesh, could you copy and paste that in the chat if anybody's interested? I don't think I pronounced it right, so apologies. Yeah, it's this lovely kind of dried fruits. It's funny because it smells like you want to drink it at Christmas, and it tastes like you want to drink it all year round. So yeah, absolutely cracking. And that beautiful structure has come from that extended aging period in old oak. So I told you I was going to talk about how barrels were made in more detail, and here we have it. So I was lucky enough to watch some barrels being made at Muga, and effectively understand what makes them so expensive. So the whole process, obviously you travel to go to find your lovely forest, you pick the particular trees that you want, and then you do something else. You have to season it. Now, these are actually not being seasoned here. These are ready to make. So this is a sort of shipment of staves that have already been seasoned, and they're ready to be made into barrels in front of my very own eyes that day. But to season it, they lay the wood out in planks, and it needs 2 to 3 years of lying out. and it needs to be outside so that it changes the moisture content of the wood. And in those 2 to 3 years, as I mentioned right at the beginning, some of the flavors change as well. So you can get, if you do it too quickly, you can get some really herbal notes. If you do it nice and slow, you can get that kind of clove note. But what you can't do, interestingly, is just chuck it in a kiln to dry it, because you get these really bitter phenols. So you actually do need to dry it out in the open air. And so basically, once you've spent all your money, and it could be for one barrel, the wood alone for a barrel could be anything around 600 euros. So once you've got your 600 euros worth of wood times, let's say 100 for that vintage, you then have to spend 2 to 3 years seasoning it, and 3 years desired. So you have to have enough space. You have to be able to look after the wood. So that's the first thing you need to do, the seasoning. The next thing you need to do is toast the wood. Now, toasting the wood is actually part of the process of making the barrel. So if I just flick back, you can see on the left here, this barrel is half made, and those are the staves. That's actually on top. If you can see my cursor, that barrel is actually on top of a fire. And if you see over here, these are the 2 other fires in this particular cooperage. What you're doing there is you're burning, luckily, the excess wood that we've got spare, and you burn it in order to heat the wood and therefore bend it into the shape. But how long for and at what temperature you heat that wood is what has a huge impact on what we call the toast levels and therefore the flavors. So if we go back to that original slide, I told you that some compounds were increased or decreased and affected by the level of toast. This is a really fascinating, just top of a barrel, which is an example. This is a lightly toasted barrel here on the right through to a heavy toasted barrel. And there are lots of different versions in between. You'll often find that coopers or wineries will mix up maybe 1 or 2 different toast levels. So our first wine had medium and medium light. So those would be around here. Muga, who we're not tasting today, but they use basically the bit right in the middle. And I should make it clear, these are little strips of wood. This isn't one piece of wood that's been toasted differently. You can hopefully see that they're little strips, just showing you the difference of those different toast levels. So essentially, how long and at what heat really affects the flavors. So let's go on to our final wine. In fact, I'll quickly talk to you about how long wines spend in barrel, because that is really important when we're talking about this wine here. How long a wine spends in barrel is really interesting, and different grapes and different regions will have different schools of thought. So Rioja, their quality pyramid has traditionally been structured on the most intense wines deserve the longest time in barrel. So barrel kind of became a signifier of quality. So a Gran Reserva Rioja needs legally 3 years in a barrel, whereas our first growth Bordeaux, this isn't a first growth, I wish I had that budget, but our first growth of Bordeaux, so Lafite Rothschild that I mentioned earlier, they don't have so long in barrel. They don't require barrel aging, and actually are more likely to spend much less time in barrel. So they might only spend between 1 and 2 years in barrel, even though both regions admit that the wine needs time in barrel and then needs time in bottle to develop complexity. In Bordeaux, they tend to age them for a much shorter period of time. Rioja tends to be longer. And then when you get into things like tawny ports, I mean, gosh, tawny ports can have 30 years in barrel. So everybody's slightly different, and things like your grape variety and your desired style of wine at the end really matter. So generally white wines need less time, but there are some grapes in the red sphere that need barrels. So Cabernet Sauvignon that we're about to taste is a grape that is very much friendly with oak barrels. The tannins are very high, and so you want to get that massage, you want to get that softening. Another grape, Nebbiolo, that often needs time in barrel. It's so dense and it's so tannic that you need to have those tannins softened, but also the flavors work very well too. Some grapes work less well. So Grenache doesn't work particularly well, for example. It oxidizes, which is basically when it takes on too much oxygen and it starts to smell, oxidized and a bit rotten. But so, for example, a Grenache, you wouldn't put a Grenache based wine in barrel for 10 years. You wouldn't want to allow it to have that much oxygen. So grape varieties depend. And then your desired style of wine at the end is also really important. So all of those factors come into play: your size, your toasting, where the barrel was from. And then with all of that information, you decide how long you want to age it for. So you may remember the big picture of the barrel at Taylor's. A tawny port, you want it to have those sort of slightly cooked, slightly developed fruit aromas. So if you're aging your a tawny port for 30 years, chances are you're not going to be doing it in a small barrel. You're going to be aging that in a really, really big barrel because you just want a bit of micro-oxygenation. You don't need to have it in small barrels. So depending on the style of wine, you have so many options to play with, and really length of time rather than age of wood. Length of time in barrel is really the last factor. It's that last final decision. How long does this wine need to go into wood for? So on that, let's talk about this wine, because this wine has done completely different things to our previous red wine. So Chateau Martin from Saint-Julien. This is a 2016, so it's younger than our wine before. It's a blend of 60% Cabernet Sauvignon. I've just told you Cabernet is a friend of oak. 25% Merlot, but it's also got 15 Petit Verdot. Now, Petit Verdot quite likes oak too, because it can be quite a punchy red grape. So we've got two grapes in here that particularly like oak, and Merlot likes a bit of oak too. So we've got a nice trinity here. Now, interestingly, this was vinified, i.e. The fermentation happened in stainless steel vats with temperature regulations. Then 12 months in French oak barrels, 1/3 new, almost 1/3 at 1-year-old, and just over 1/3 of 2-year-old wood. So all very, very new. So basically, we've turned the volume up on the wood here. Our previous wine had a longer aging period, 3 times longer aging, but all in old wood. So there was less kind of influence of the wood, shall we say. This wine, shorter period of time, only 12 months, but those French oak 225 litre barrels are going to be influencing it. So it's still a lighter style of Saint-Julien, I would say, and it's known for its kind of early drinking ease. But one of the reasons is it's almost like the oak has sort of shocked it into being early drinking. So let's have a smell and a taste and see if you can pick up some of those aromas, because remember, with all that new wood, we should be able to. So I'm getting immediately already some herbaceous notes, almost clove-like. I'm getting a slightly toasted, woody toasted smell. Often you get that cigar box aroma, which I think you can associate with wood as well. Yeah, there's something really herbal and very smoky as well, but it's not like an old stale smoke. It reminds me of smoked herbs. So when you, if you have pop herbs on the barbecue, which we love doing, it kind of reminds me of that character, but still packed with black fruit. It's not a tertiary wine. It's not full of savory characters. It's got all of that beautiful blackcurrant fruit as well. Let's have a taste. So in the world of Saint-Julien wines, this isn't particularly the highest tannins, but I do think that you can tell that the wood has softened those tannins slightly. Can you feel they've almost lignified? That polymerization has happened. They're really, really silky. And that is one classic telltale sign of some really good oak aging. Silky tannins. They're soft. Yes, they're there. They're present. I can feel them in my mouth, but they're not jarring. They feel really plush. Which is gorgeous, and the Merlot will help that a bit, but certainly you can tell that it's had that softening. In terms of flavors, I'm not getting as many oaky flavors as I did on the nose. If anything, I'm getting a slightly sweeter oak flavor. I don't know whether any members are. I'm getting almost, it's not vanilla, but it is bordering on that kind of sweet spice flavor. So it is a little more sweet, whereas the nose was a bit more herbaceous, I would say. Such a stonking wine. I mean, for an early drinking claret, I think you can't really go wrong with that. It's definitely the sort of light, elegant style, which means that if you're all sort of sweating in the heat wave in the UK, then this actually is a lovely wine if you wanted to have a Bordeaux on this type of weather. Yes, so I hope, I hope that you liked all three of those wines if you tasted all three. I think they're three excellent examples of how different oak aging can be, right from our first wine, our Chardonnay, that was all about the flavour. Our second wine, which was ignoring the flavour, and we were talking about the extended micro-oxygenation. And then our final wine, which is a little bit of both, but has had a decent, relatively intense aging period, should I say. Just because I wanted to show you one final photo before we go on to questions. This is the only one I didn't take, but only because I tried to take so many pictures when I was here, and it was all of my photos were a disaster. But this is the barrel room, very famous barrel room of Lafite, which is just a sight to behold. And I mentioned I was going to talk to you about some facts and figures, numbers wise. I told you that the raw materials alone could be around 600 euros. If you are buying a good barrel, a really top quality barrel from a really reputable cooper, and you have worked with them to produce those barrels at your spec, you could be paying easily 1,000 euros a barrel. So if you want to do the mental maths, this is half of the room at Lafite. And these barrels are all worth 1,000 euros each. So you can start to do some mental maths about what an expensive endeavor it is to produce wines like this. Then when you throw into the mix that Bordeaux producers are often using, as we've just seen, first, second, and third, because they do want the oak to make a mark. They want to use those early flavors and get the most out of their oak. So they're replacing the entire of this room every 3 years. So you can let that sink in for a moment. It is an expensive exercise. If we want to do some mental maths, if you're buying your barrel for 1,000 euros and you're only using it for 3 years and it only stores 300 bottles of wine, then every oak barrel contributes £1 to your bottle of wine, which doesn't sound like a lot in the grand scheme of things, but actually when you're producing tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of wine, that really, really adds up. So therein ends my sort of rant. I wanted to talk about a little bit before I go into the Q&A, but I actually think I've seen a question pop up on it. I wanted to talk a little bit about what alternatives there are for oak. Now, we talked at the beginning, you can use cherry and acacia and other types of wood, but what if you don't want to use wood at all? What you can do, and I've seen this done with varying degrees of success, one really interesting thing that you can do is you can add staves, so the strips of wood, without actually making them into barrels. You can almost dunk them, a bit like I always think of it like a colander. You can dunk them into your wine, and that will impart flavor, but it won't do the micro-oxygenation part. So only that flavor element. But you can really control that flavor. So you can have, different levels of toasting. You can decide it might be in a big stainless steel vat. You might say, right, okay, well, actually it's going the way we wanted it to go. Let's take them out early or let's put a lighter toasting in. So you've got loads of flexibility. And Sarah Knowles is a big fan of this production method because it does keep the cost of wines down. And if you're micro-oxygenating with, I mentioned earlier, the little bubbles that you can pump through your wine, you're actually cheating, but in a really, really top quality way, if you do it well. There are plenty of bad examples, of course there are, but Sarah's really keen on that particular production method in the USA, where they're reining in on the oak use, and actually that can provide a really good level a good level of oak influence. The other things are you can add oak. add oak powder, which is effectively a bit like adding, you can also add tannins, but you can add oak powder, which is almost like a flavoring. You can't do that in all countries. Actually, I think you can do it in Europe now, but it's not very commonly practiced with wines that are over £5. Somewhere in the middle of those is oak chips. So it's not a powder, it's not your big staves. So they're much lower in quality. And they don't really do anything at all with the texture, obviously, but also they tend to not be the best pieces of wood, so they'll be offcuts and things like that, and you're probably less likely to be able to work out where they were sourced. Your toasting levels won't be under control, but you basically dunk a tea bag. So one's like a colander, and this is more like a tea bag of chips in. So that's somewhere in between those. You've got the powder, you've got the staves, and then you've got the chips in the middle. The one thing you can't do legally, certainly in Europe, but I'm not sure anywhere it's actually legal anymore, is oak essence, which is basically like an additive. It's a liquid that you pour in. To my knowledge, it's definitely not legal in the European Union, but it used to be legal in the USA, and I'm not sure it is now. But one telltale sign of any of those, well, not the illegal one, but one telltale sign of the powdered or the chips or the staves is if there's slightly strange language on the back of the bottle. So it might not tell you about the barrels, but it might say oak influenced. That's classic terminology. So if there's kind of obscure language about the oak, but not telling you about the barrels or length of time in barrel, and it just says an oaky wine or an oak influenced wine, then you might find that that's what that's talking about. But like I said, not all bad. There are some exceptionally good wines using staves. And even where they're lining the insides of other vessels with staves of wood, which is just a cheaper alternative. But like I said, it's doing more of the flavor part. It's not doing much to do with the structure and the texture of the wine. Right, there we go. Sorry, that was a bit of a brain dump. I've got so excited learning more and more about oxygenation and oak and flavors. So yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but I've really enjoyed putting all of this together. So hopefully I'll be able to answer some of your questions. So let's start with Tim Jones, who has asked, one doesn't think of Pinot as being oaky. How is a good red Burgundy matured? And I've actually had a similar question I saw pop through from Nick, who said, would you say something like Pinot is the opposite, i.e. the barrels add the tannins? So Nick's half answered my question for me. One thing that's very interesting, that's quite rare, is because Pinot Noir from Burgundy or elsewhere is often very low in tannins. And oak, I mentioned right at the beginning, has their own type of tannin. So they're called elagid tannins, and they are actually part of the wood. You can actually leach almost this slightly different textured tannin into your Burgundy or into your Pinot Noir from the oak. So although you don't, Tim, you're saying you don't think of Pinot as being oaky, I would recommend trying a Burgundy that often has this process. So what they'll tend to do is have a very low level of toast. So let's go through this. Let's go through what they would do. So you probably have quite a low level of toast because you don't necessarily want to be imparting loads and loads of flavors. They would also have, going right back to the beginning, they would have one of our French species of oak, and they would probably have the middle one from the column. So I was going to try and share it again, but it doesn't seem to be coming up. So they'd have the finest, very tight grained and extractable aromas. But if you're low levels of toast, then you're not going to be bumping up those extractable aromas. So we're going to have low levels of toast. We're going to have really fine grained wood. We're going to have 2 to 8 litre barrels. That's more common in Burgundy than 225. And then what we'll do is we won't age them for quite as long. So we could be anywhere from 6 months to 18 months. But we will be making sure that we're not extracting flavour, but actually what you are doing is completely changing the structure. So oaked Pinot Noir, oaked Burgundy is a very, very different structure. So Tim, although you wouldn't think of it as an oaky wine necessarily, I would encourage you to try unoaked Pinot Noir, completely unoaked Pinot Noir next to oaked Pinot Noir. Unfortunately, the price difference of those wines is probably going to be huge for all the reasons I've explained. So the quality levels will naturally be different, but there is this kind of structural, slightly tannic, ever so slightly sometimes smoky, but that really is about it. You don't want to be getting. I've had very, very oaky Pinot Noir from the New World before that's like a vanilla fruit cherry bomb. It's not a style that I particularly like. New World is moving away from oaking Pinot Noir in small barriques as well. So we had a producer on recently from Sonoma who is doing 500-litre German Botti for the aging of her Pinot Noir, which is very traditional in Germany. So Spätburgunder would be aged in 500 litres because they don't want to get too much wine in contact with the side of the barrel. So I hope that answers the question. Pinot is a slight confusing one. Oh, don't worry, Mahesh. Mahesh said to share the PowerPoint, but I think it's all right. Hopefully we answered the question well enough. Will has said, when you say a third is in 1-year-old barrels, 1/3 in 2-year-old barrels, does that suggest they blend the wine thereafter? Exactly. So I will share my PowerPoint hopefully this time. Yes. So just to give you an idea, and I'm making this up, but to give you an idea, let's say all of the top row are first-year barrels and all of the bottom row are second-year barrels, but all of this wine would have come from the same vintage, for example. So what they then have to do is take all of these barrels and mix them together. What's really interesting, and I've never done this, one of the most interesting things about barrels is because all of these, so if you don't have an in-house cooper, all of these barrels will be made from different producers in different parts of the world sometimes, but often France, Germany. If we're talking French claret. When I was in Bordeaux recently, I heard of people mixing in German and Austrian wood as well, which is something that 10, 15 years ago, I don't think would be very common. And so actually, if you go through and taste barrel samples, so taste barrel by barrel in one of those barrel rooms, all of those barrels will taste different. So you have to be the most incredible winemaker by knowing, right, I have got 10% of my wines are in Burgundian forest, medium level toast barrels. 5% of my wine are in German medium level toast barrels. And it's almost like you have this smorgasbord of different things to then blend the final wine. Now, of course, there's going to be some barrels that don't work out so well, and there's always a bit of room for error. But actually, each individual barrel will taste different. And the age of the barrels, like we said, if they're all different, so you must blend the wine afterwards. It's not a case of just siphoning off 300 bottles from each and off they go. They all go back into big blending vats afterwards, which is a huge task and something that I'm very much not jealous about. So Victoria has said, if flavour is not being imparted, what is an obvious giveaway for oak? Is it the tannin structure, and how would you know? Sometimes the best wines you don't know. I know that's a strange thing to say, but the one thing that I always think is softness of tannins. If your tannins feel like they're soft and they're really well integrated, I think that's often a telltale sign for oak. It can be other things and it can be a little bit hard to pull out, but for me, the softness of those two red wines is the telltale sign. The tannins didn't sort of stick to my gums in a chalky, harsh way. They were really quite softened. So that's one thing that I would say is a big telltale sign for me. Nick, because American oak is less subtle than French, do winemakers age for less time in American oak? Not necessarily. It depends on the style of wine you're after, and it comes down to whether you want things like those high lactone wines. So, for example, traditional Riojas were very, very much, so they tasted like Bounty bars. They were chocolate, coconut, and some red fruits. Not that there's red fruits in a Bounty bar, but that was the style they wanted. That is changing, and there's a lot more French oak, arguably more French oak than American now. The reason that they used to use so much American oak, obviously it became stylistic, but the reason was that they had a much better trading agreement during the Franco era with America, and they had a really, really bad relationship with France, so they couldn't use French oak. And then it made this incredible style of wine that we all love. I mean, those Bounty Bar wines are divine. They're quite hard to get hold of now. So you can, in a way, you can use American oak really, really well to produce certain top quality wines, and you might want to age it for even longer if that's the style you're going for. So yeah, it's a stylistic thing. I think we've got time for one more quick question, because Victoria's asked, when you say high lactone, is that the malolactic conversion that happens? No, lactone is a compound found in oak, and lactone, from really early in the beginning slides, and if you missed it, sorry, Victoria, but lactone is the coconut flavor that you get from oak. So it's a compound found within oak. Right, I'm going to ask one more question because I think I've got time. Is climate change having an effect, good or bad, on oak trees? Great question, Nick, because I don't know the answer, so it's a great question for me to end on. So sadly, I don't actually know. I know that a lot of producers are very conscious about their use of oak. To give you a little bit of context, the oak trees they have to use, I can't remember how many barrels come from a tree, but it's not a huge amount. And then the age of those trees, I think for like sometimes it's actually regulated, but for a top quality barrel, you're looking at about a 70-year-old tree. So a lot of producers, I don't know about climate change, but in terms of sustainability, a lot of producers now are really looking towards more sustainable practices, i.e. maybe not using oak at all, or going to staves. We visited people in Bordeaux who are going to concrete because it's more sustainable, and they think that they're getting enough micro-oxygenation from the concrete. So I don't know about climate change in terms of the actual impact of the climate itself, but from a preserving and being conscientious about our planet, a lot of producers are being very, very mindful about their use of oak. And if they are saying they want to still continue using oak, then there's a lot of people planting forests and huge schemes, planting to replace the trees that are being used through oak. So a really fair question. I know I couldn't quite answer it exactly how you wanted, so I apologize. Right, lovely stuff. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Sorry it was a huge topic. Again, our focus on topics are always massive, but I honestly have had such a ball doing a little bit of extra research and showing you some of my photos as well. I hope you humoured me, but I've really enjoyed learning about this, and I love oaky wines, so I'm going to go and enjoy my Chardonnay with my dinner, which I believe is prawns in ginger, which might work. So I hope you had a great evening. Thank you again, Mahesh, and I will see everyone in a few weeks when I am back. Thank you all.